and welcome to Red Read. Today I wanted to talk about The Loser by Thomas Bernhard. This is the first Bernhard novel that I've read, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how he got onto my radar. So this and Corrections was bought for me as a Christmas gift. It was on my book depository, which is now defunct, wish list, and but I didn't know anything about Bernhard. I just knew that he was an Austrian writer. I think I'd heard him talked about in an interview, but also just seen people that I follow on social media having read his books, and I was like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll pick up some of his most popular works. And when I got The Loser and I quickly kind of just skimmed the blurb, I was like, I couldn't believe that this was what this book was going to be about, and it was so immensely interesting to me. And then the other thing that I did, which I usually do with books, is just quickly flick through the pages to look and see if there is any interesting formatting or structural or text layout stuff that's going on. So, in the same way that I just flicked through Ulysses and I was like, why is this all of a sudden a play for 80 pages? And then, what is this? Is this a questionnaire, a survey? Now I just am in the habit of quickly doing that. And I did notice with the Bernhard's The Loser that it is the rectangles of death that I like to think there's just unbroken paragraphs, like rectangles of text with no paragraph breaks, no quotation marks. And so I was like, oh man, is this going to be a drag to read? Because sometimes it can be, but the experience of actually reading the book it's quite unique, really almost perversely seductive, because because even though Bernhard seems to break some really obvious rules in writing, I think it's a really good example of breaking the rules in a powerful, affective way. And so just to give the general plot and what the book is going to be about, if you've read Moby Dick, then the way that and if you've seen my video talking about Moby Dick, then the way that I describe the process of reading that book is that you go into a bar, you sit down, you meet some guy, and then you just start you each get a drink, you're talking, you have some casual conversations, and then all of a sudden you turn and ask, you say hey, so what are you into? What's your thing? And he just turns wide-eyed and is like, dude, I'm obsessed with whales. And then he goes on a 4-hour or 500-page rant on all things to do with whales, and you can tell that he's so passionate about it that you're really you get sucked in, even though you don't really care or know anything about whales, but because he's talking in such a passionate way, then you kind of get sucked in as well. Well, reading The Loser, imagine that same setting, except it's not a nice, compassionate guy sitting there. Some random Austrian drunkard just barges in and at the top of his lungs just starts screaming his life story. And that is what this experience is, what the experience of reading this book is like. And it's it could be a bit uncomfortable at first. There is no holds barred. He will talk absolute hardcore trash about anyone and anything that comes in. So I think in Bernhard's real life, he has a sort of love-hate relationship with Austria, but at least insofar as it's coming through with this book, it's really just a hardcore hate. And so the idea, I've still kind of danced around the plot because it is still just so absurd that I cannot believe it, but the plot centers around 3 pianists. The first is our narrator, the second is our narrator's friend, known as Wertheimer, and the third is a fictional representation of Glenn Gould, the famous classical pianist, the famous Canadian classical pianist. He was famous for his interpretations of Bach, and he was just... but he has been fictionalized, and a lot of details or biographical details from Bernhard's own life have been put into Glenn Gould, and particularly with the fact that in this book Glenn Gould studied in Salzburg at the Mozart University, which is not true at all. That's actually where Bernhard studied, because Bernhard did study music and then went on to become a writer later on in his life. And but anyway, the idea is essentially that the act of meeting Glenn Gould destroyed these other two characters. So we've got our unnamed narrator and Wertheimer is so kind of destroyed by Glenn Gould's just hearing him play that he eventually goes on to commit suicide. He is the novel's titular, the loser, as fictional, again, fictional, like the character Glenn Gould is a fictional character, even though some things align, of course. Because Glenn Gould just referred to him as the loser, and a lot of the story is kind of focusing on details of Wertheimer and what led to his eventual suicide. And our main character, our narrator, he has gone just kind of sort of crazy. He's also given up playing the piano. He gives some biographical details of himself, but he ended up going on to study philosophy, and he's trying to write an essay. Like, he's been trying for like 9 years to write essays about Glenn Gould. Sometimes it's called about Glenn Gould, and then other things, but that is what the book sort of ends up being. And I will go through and just read some example sentences, but really I do want to stress that just the process of reading this book is a lot of the effect of reading this book, and it can't really be summarized because, like I mentioned, some of those sort of writing rules that get broken, more or whatever that means. There's an idea of like not repeating yourself in a book. Like, if you've written a sentence, it's already been written, but and just kind of like repeating it feels like it might come across as amateurish writing, especially if you're repeating like adjectives or something. Then we already see a lot. We see a lot, like we criticize a lot of sort of fan fiction and things like that because they always use the same adjectives or adverbs. But in this, you will get sometimes the same sentence repeated verbatim, and like I can't really think of the example right now, but you will just intrinsically feel it. Like, you're like, this main character has said Glenn Gould has destroyed Wertheimer like dozens of times, but it just contributes to this constant sort of like obsessive, neurotic, maybe like kind of bordering on mental illness like representation of this character. There's also a kind of constant framing reference where you will read sentences that will say something along the lines of, "I never really liked walking in this park, Wertheimer thought. I thought as I sat in the inn." And so it's this always constant like hardcore like bringing you back to the present day and realizing that it's not a story that you're not permitted to be like a fly on the wall looking at all of these characters happening, all of these things happening in the third person. It is always fundamentally a first person story, and you will constantly get drawn back to the reality that all of this stuff that is happening in this book is thoughts and reflections of our main character, and he will just constantly say, "I thought as I sat in the inn, I thought as I walked to the house, blah 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 blah," even to the point of the sentence coming across as like really quite janky. And like, the sentences are janky. I'll try and read some examples, but it works. All I can say is that it works, and it was never like there are times where you will look at sentences and you're just like, why is that not a semicolon, or why is that not just a full stop? But it's something where as soon as you almost kind of buy into the insanity, then a lot of other things become permissible. And really, I think Bernhard's craft is getting you to buy into that insanity, and it doesn't just come across as amateurish. But anyway, I'll just flick through. There's a lot of sentences. They might not make sense out of context, but I'll try and pick ones that make the more sense and kind of give a good idea of what reading or what you'll see or find in this book. Okay, so in this sentence, he's talking about Glenn Gould and the fact that again, another fictionalized thing. In this book, he has a lung disease, which actually Thomas Bernhard had, but I'll read this example. This is talking about Glenn Gould. "He never gave up the piano, I thought. Of course not. Whereas Wertheimer and I gave up the piano because we never attained the inhuman state Glenn attained, who, by the way, never escaped this inhuman state, who didn't even want to escape this inhuman state." And then going on, talking about why Wertheimer, like the effect of Wertheimer and our narrator moving away from performing. Without my music, which from one day to the next I could no longer tolerate, I deteriorated. Without practical music, theoretical music from the very moment had only a catastrophic effect on me. From one moment to the next, I hated my piano, my own, couldn't bear to hear myself play again. I no longer wanted to paw at my instrument. And here's another clear example of this sort of insanity, like just the effect of what it's like hearing this person rant. If I hadn't met Glenn Gould, I probably wouldn't have given up the piano, and I would have become a piano virtuoso, and perhaps even one of the best piano virtuosos in the world, I thought in the inn. Early on, you start to get some aphorisms that come up in the book, and I skipped over a couple, but one I'm going to read and then talk about is: Wertheimer had to commit suicide, I told myself. He had no future left. He'd used himself up, had run out of existence coupons. And it's really funny because you start to get some of these aphorisms, but then the book goes on to criticize the concept of aphorisms, because Wertheimer would write like thousands and tens and thousands of aphorisms, and it's really funny because that's introduced partway through. You then go on to be skeptical about the aphorisms that are written later on in the book, and yeah, the narrator is so like complex, and I really loved it, because you don't know, like, obviously there are things that are bleeding in, like or bleeding out almost, with like details and projections of things. You're almost trying to piece together what the narrator what actually happened to the narrator and what his life story is about by like the projections that he's putting on to Glenn Gould and the character of Wertheimer. And I had to highlight this one because this is just filled with so much anger, and I can't believe it. Remember when I was talking about his sort of love-hate relationship with Austria? He's sitting in the inn. I took a few steps toward the kitchen window, although I'd already realized I couldn't look through the kitchen window because, as already mentioned, it's covered with filth from top to bottom. Austrian kitchen windows are all totally filthy and we can't look through them, and naturally it's to our greatest advantage, I thought, not to be able to look through them, because then we find ourselves staring into the mouth of catastrophe, into the chaos of Austrian kitchen filth. And he's just so angry, like that's part of the appeal as well, is you're just going along for the ride of just seeing this guy rant his heart out. Yeah, about page 65, this is the part where he criticizes aphorisms, probably also talking about people like Schopenhauer, but in reality, I'm nothing other than one of those aphorizing public menaces who, in their boundless unscrupulousness and impudence, tag along behind philosophers like horseflies behind a horse, he said, I thought. And so, probably about page 120, 130, the book starts to focus less on Glenn Gould, especially after, like, in terms of the recount of the story after our narrator has gone to Wertheimer's funeral, and it just starts and is now sitting at the inn waiting to go to his house. It starts to reflect a lot just on Austria, and we do have like things come back in, but you will then go on to spend a lot of time talking about Wertheimer and his relationship with his sister, the fact that his sister ran away to get married to a Swiss man, like a very rich Swiss man, and so it goes on. The book goes on to reflect more on like the nature of like work and general fulfillment and going crazy, but it still maintains this like very strong forward momentum, because by this point you're so committed to the prose and you're like committed to the characters as well that you'll just kind of ride it out and get all the way to the end. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to say about Thomas Bernhard's The Loser. I hope that, like, I know that I kind of failed in conveying like the process of reading it, of course, because like you just go and read it, but I hope I talked enough about what I found so attractive about this book, the fact that it is really, really like addictive to read, and I think it'll be a unique experience at least. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.